Morning. Last one before lunch. Very conscious that you're probably all hungry. So hopefully you get some value out of this one. So winter is coming for PMOs. Who thought I was going to use a Game of Thrones reference? Yeah, I kind of was going to do, and then I decided against it. And I really wanted to use a garden analogy instead. And you'll see why a bit later. So I just want to get a feel for who's in the room at the moment. Who works in a PMO at the moment? Okay, who is impacted by PMOs? Oh, some are impacted and some work in them. Okay, so hopefully this will give you some value. So my learning objectives are really around how can we change the script of a PMO. I'm going to be introducing you to the Adaptive Management Office and how PMOs can become adaptive and resilient, and also what is the cultural and mindset shift required for a PMO, and how can you start some of that transformation. So roughly translated, Ichigo, Ichi-E, is one meeting, one moment in time that won't happen again. So I hope by sharing my knowledge with you that I actually start a new shoot with you today. So just a bit about me. I'm a bit of a maths nerd. Come in. I'm a bit of a maths nerd. I did mathematics and computer science at university, and then really went into BA and development, and I then moved into the PMO space, working in project assurance and performance measurement. And then I went to the dark side. I was a project manager in both the UK and Australia for a while. And then Eureka! I discovered Agile and Agility, probably about 7 years ago. I've worked as a Scrum Master, Agile Delivery Lead, and now I'm primarily working in business agility and helping organisations transform. And I really love metrics. I have a passion for metrics. And I've heard quite a few people talk about data and metrics, so I'm going to talk about that a bit more later. And it fascinates me how you can use data and metrics to actually influence behavioural change. So I've worked across a number of industries. I've worked in telcos, financial services, government, utilities, a bit of everything really. So I'm a bit of a mishmash of things that have nurtured me in my garden. So I have a number of concerns for both the PMO and Agile. I've worked in both spaces, and I've really developed a number of concerns about how the two face off. I've really seen organisations shift to Agile, but without actually solving the blockers outside the teams. So team culture has shifted, but organisational culture in the ecosystem hasn't necessarily. And PMOs were very often having to work within those constraints rather than rethink what was now the problems that they needed to solve. For example, I don't think anybody's found a way around the financial and funding constraints that constraints within organisations. So they hadn't adapted. I've seen Agile teams fight against the governance. Very often people believe that those governance restrictions are imposed on them for no reason, and rather than work with them, they work against them and they fight against them. They go around them, they don't embrace them. They don't see the value. But I feel there is a need for both to coexist, and they need to coexist so that organisations can succeed. So I want to introduce you to adaptive management, which I actually believe can help. So I came across the term when I was doing, the usual Googling around this, Agile Management Office, Value Delivery Management Office, and I felt that was really too narrow and didn't really reflect the true nature of how organisations now need to adapt. Agile's within the common language, but people have different interpretations of what it means. Some people have got some scars over how Agile has been implemented in their organisations. So I've actually borrowed a term from environmental science, and that really resonated with me. And because it's from environmental science, it's about the ecosystem. So what is adaptive management? Well, in the garden, it's about choosing the right plant for the right environment. It's about adapting to uncertainty. And I want to show you a framework that I've been using, how you can put this into place within your PMO. Just before we go to the framework, I want to introduce you to a case study. It's a client that I've been working with for about 9 to 12 months at the moment. Organisation X, let's call them. They actually wanted to fundamentally disrupt the way that they're delivering value. They'd established Agile teams and an Agile management office. but they actually fundamentally hadn't changed anything that they did, apart from renaming themselves from a PMO. We're very proud, we're now an Agile Management Office, but we actually haven't changed. They were very, very proud of the tool they were using. It was one of their most fundamental successes that they felt. We've introduced an Agile tool. It's amazing. And that they had all the data in there as well. However, there was scepticism, a lot of scepticism within the teams themselves. There was scepticism within the PMO, or the AMO, as they called themselves. Some wanted to just operate in the same way. Some had some great energy and were thinking, well, why aren't we doing anything any differently? And they really had nowhere to direct it. The PMO manager, and I've seen this in a couple of clients, yes, I'm changing, when really that person is saying, no, why do I need to change? There's no need for me to change, I can just continue doing the same thing. So there was no evidence that he actually fundamentally wanted anything to change for him personally, or for his team either. So how is an AMO different to a PMO? Well, the shift for the PMO in moving to one that embraces adaptive management is actually a shift from one of compliance, or policing, controlling are some of the words that get used, to the creation of an ecosystem that is resilient to that continuous change. The focus is on right-size governance and how you support the teams in the delivery to value. It's about looking to extract actionable information that can be used to input to some of those control processes. And Mick touched on it this morning. It's about valuing test, measure, learn and experimentation. So I'm probably going to challenge a couple of things that Nancy spoke about this morning. So I'd like to introduce you to some of the seeds that we've been nurturing in our garden. Like Mick said earlier, we've been learning around this. We've had some failures and we've learned from those. But our experience so far is that these seeds work in the habitat that we're working with, but we're still experimenting as to whether these are the right seeds to work in a number of different habitats and environments. So like any gardener, you need to be smart about what you plant where. Some seeds in your environment might need nurturing more than others. So I'm going to be talking to each one of these seeds in a bit more detail. So governance interactions, portfolio ceremonies, portfolio measures and reporting, a knowledge system, frameworks and guides, and portfolio tools. But the most important of all is habitat, or the ecosystem. So at the heart of a PMO and at the heart of an organisation, the habitat is at the heart. It's about creating an ecosystem that can self-sustain and be resilient to continuous change. So a gardener works to principle rather than to rule. They prune the plants when they need it. They don't prune them every 2 months or every 3 months. So in the same way, PMOs need to work to principle. The mindset of a culture and PMO needs to shift. And that can actually start by co-creating a set of principles that can support that transformation. The principles then become our guide to actually help us do something which may not be embedded within our innate behaviour. There's something that actually help guide us in our decision making, and these are some of the principles that we actually co-created with Organisation X. Your principles might be something that's completely different. What those principles then allow you to do is, if there's behaviour that isn't aligned to that, you use those principles to support a shift in that behaviour. So as a gardener working across different gardens in your neighbourhood, you actually need to know the environment state that they operate under. A garden in the outback may be one that's very different to the rainy north of England, where I'm from. It's critically important that not just the environment of a PMO itself operates, but actually the habitat around it. And mindset and culture change starts from the top. And the role of leadership in supporting any change within the environment is critical. But also that role of leadership as the PMO in supporting that cultural change is critical. So it can't happen overnight. Coaching, culture hacks, Gartner came up with something called culture hacks. They're examples of how you can try to drive a different level of cultural maturity. But it's critical when understanding the future state of the PMO that the organisational context is considered. Can you be successful as a PMO if your organisation around you doesn't change? So a number of questions can be posed. What are the expectations and purpose of the PMO? Has it actually changed from when it was originally formed? in order to deliver any new organisational change or support innovation, what is the revised purpose of the PMO? Do they actually have the right levels of empowerment and decision making to actually be able to affect any change? So empowerment is critical, but that empowerment needs to be used in the right way, and having a growth mindset is actually key to changing that habitat. Okay, so touching on our first seed. So we're now transitioning from winter to spring. What do we actually consider? So who's heard of Conf? Great, excellent. For those of you that haven't, Conf is a model that I think Dave Snowden came up with. It talks to simple, complex, complicated and chaotic. So it's critical that the right size governance is introduced, and governance of the team should depend on the complexity of the problem. How are you governing something that's chaotic versus governing something that's simple? Governance in agile teams, we've talked about, can seem a bit like a dirty word, and that can be one of the major blockers within a PMO habitat, as well as the need to replicate the same governance style for all the different ways of operating. Like a garden, different gardens need different treatments, and governing teams and governing portfolios is no different. So work that is innovative needs a different governance style, and Mick touched on some of that this morning. John Cotter wrote a book about dual operating systems, a book called Accelerates, and he talks to the need for governing through innovation as an operating system versus governing what you would consider as BAU and support. So this is something that's from an adaptive governance diagram from Gartner, and I thought it really nailed what do we need for the future. So what are the types of questions that a PMO now needs to ask? And what are the types of questions that the members of the leaders that are empowered as members of governance, what do they look like? Well, they need to become more objective. Governance becomes about establishing the right decision-making guardrails, where success is how decisions and empowerment start to shift to a team. Empowerment doesn't just happen. It needs to be supported by the right leadership and knowledge system, and I'll touch on the knowledge system a bit more later. The PMO shouldn't be policing to this, but should be asking, what are the decision-making experiments we want to try? What patterns are we seeing in decision-making? How is that looking across the portfolio levels, and how is that impacting our value delivery? Can we accelerate our decision-making to deliver value more seamlessly? Portfolio ceremonies. Well, they need to go beyond governance in an adaptive environment. There's a need to look at how leadership convene and how that needs to change. And there's a more sustained view of value that's required, and that actually requires new forms of decision making. So that might mean the removal of existing ceremonies and the creation of new ones, or a focus and change in existing. So for example, how does prioritisation change? What are the feedback and information loops? How do you bring macro level reflection into play into your PMO? And what are the data and insights that feed into decision making? So that's an example of a portfolio lens from Organisation X. They actually run all their new portfolio ceremonies in there. It's something we use called the Hive, and that's about connecting the whole team to the customer itself. Portfolio level prioritisation happens in there, scrum of scrums, macro retrospectives, we play back some of those in there, and also leadership coaching. So one of the key ceremonies about shifting the habitat and the ecosystem of leaders is about changing the way that they lead. So leadership coaching occurs in the same space where the teams engage and collaborate together. So John Doerr wrote a book called Measure What Matters, and it was about introducing new measures and goal-setting techniques called OKRs, and I think there's been a couple of other talks on that today. I know there was one earlier, and I think there's one this afternoon as well. So OKRs, objectives and key results, and he leveraged those at Google and LinkedIn and quite a number of other startup organisations very successfully. His book isn't called Measure What You Always Did Before. Like agile teams, in the PMO, data is your friend. Data leads to insights, which supports decision making. And the PMO needs to move from reactive to proactive, from lagging status reports, red, amber, green, to leading. What are some of the decision-making patterns showing us? How are they supporting us in how we can transform our teams? There needs to be the flexibility to measure something when it matters, to help shift behaviour, and when that behaviour is embedded, to actually stop measuring that, drop it, measure something else that will give you a different insight. And that's really important for the PMO to understand across the portfolio. So you need to constantly question what you are measuring. How does the different data correlate at a portfolio level? And what is required in that new PMO? There's also a need to look at different ways to visualise that data. Try and shift perception by looking at how you can use the visual to change the way that leaders absorb the information. So some examples of new measures: you've got bottlenecks in the flow of value, resilience to changing priorities, measurement of wait time, team health, decision making and how it supports or impedes the portfolio. And Mick mentioned this earlier, which is one that I'd never thought of, speed of learning. So how might you measure that across the portfolio? How is learning actually helping you drive value? So we touched earlier on empowerment, and it doesn't happen overnight. So in order to build responsibility rather than doff accountability onto people, knowledge needs to be grown, and the PMO has a key role in that. They need to go beyond capacity and demand planning and actually start to look at how do they support the knowledge system, how do they support the knowledge moving from something that's created to incubated to embedded within the organisation. But also, not just the change in capability that the rest of the organisation needs to apply, but what is the different capabilities that a PMO of the future needs to have? So the traditional role of a project manager may actually be more aligned to pattern and trend recognition. Data science skills and actually interrogating the data may be something that's a required PMO capability of the future. So just something to think about, and quite passionate, because measures is something that I'm very passionate about, and pattern recognition. Processes and practices, that would previously have been something that was one of the most critical parts of the PMO. Who's seen a process and practice checklist? Yep, we've all been there. But I feel for me, it's actually one of my least important seeds to plant. So I actually really like this example from LAST, so from large scale Scrum. So the role of the PMO doesn't become about policing to processes and practices, but actually governing the frameworks and encouraging the sharing of knowledge. So previously processes and practices would be anchored in very little change, but to support continuous change, the role of the PMO needs to be about how can they support leading practice? How does experimentation and feedback evolve the framework? And how are good ideas shared? And also in the same way as we looked at metrics, questioning the need for the framework and process is also a key part of the change for the PMO, to move them from controlling to supportive. So an example would be those traditional checklists. How do they morph into team and portfolio health checks? And then how is the PMO providing that data back to the teams to actually support them with any behavioural shift, rather than policing to, have you done this, have you done that? This is an ex-colleague about 6 years ago. I loved his quote, and I reuse it as often as I can. A fool with a tool is still a fool. Like a gardener, the purpose and use of tools is critical to them. They don't use weed killer to kill an infestation of aphids. So tools should actually support the purpose of a PMO and the organisation and the drive for data-driven decision making. There's a need to shift in reporting and data. So there's a need to actually shift the tools that you use. And the role of the PMO is to actually ensure that tools are fit for purpose. So as you're looking at its initial experimentation, look at a lower investment and things like that. Don't bring in a tool right at the start of your transformation. Look at it, look at what is the data and decision making that you need, and bring in a tool that is something that helps support you once you've started to bed some of that in. So back to Organisation X. This is some of the Kanban walls of the PMO. So where are we 9 months in? Well, we actually focused on habitat first with them, and we saw some of the biggest changes. There was a lot of energy, there was a mindset shift, but also there was a greater humility about what they didn't know rather than what they did know. We've seen a greater resilience to change. They were actually going through a major transformation and transition and merging of different departments. I won't go into who it is. And they have demonstrated a greater level of resilience to that change. And that's something that we've been able to measure because we've been tracking decision making. The PMO manager 9 months later actually said to me, I now look back and I understand as an individual why I needed to change. And he's not just saying that for saying its sake. And he was actually very proud that one of his team had actually used data to drive and influence some of his decision making recently. They have their Hive, they have their collaboration and portfolio lens space, and that used to be inside out, so it was very much people and project focused, and now it's very much outside in, so customer, product and value focused. And the customer is at the heart of all those central discussions. The AMO owns it, and they actually drive behavioural change through this. They use different visualisations to try to seek different changes in behaviour. And they come up with those ideas themselves. I, as a consultant, I don't need to be there all the time. So they're using those different collaboration forums, and they're looking at what is the data that they derive from there. We're just in the middle of running a mega discovery with them. There's about 70 people across 6 product teams. The AMO have actually chosen to be embedded within those teams during the discovery. They want to look at what are the different portfolio opportunities that might be there, what are the different measures and data that they need to capture to actually support the teams. So they're there as a supporter, not as a police, and the teams have embraced them as such. The tool's no longer the priority. So proud, so proud. And they actually have a backlog of change initiatives themselves. They're using agility to adopt agility in themselves. So they've got strategic change initiatives. It's not perfect. We're still maturing some of the governance there, and we're still trying to break some of the silos within the AMO itself. You know, a comms person must do comms. So to finish, how are you going to breathe new life into your PMO? What are the seeds of change that you're going to sow, and how many? And how will you use data to support behavioural change? I'm actually going to challenge you to choose your own starting point to disrupt, and I'd love to hear back from you around what are the different seeds that you've sown in your garden? How have you used some of these seeds that I've provided to you today? So I've taken you on a bit of a jog through my adaptive garden. If you want a longer meander, more of a stroll, then please feel free to grab me, ring me, whatever, and happy to talk. That's it. Any questions? None? Wow. None? Okay.
Maybe just a comment. I think it was good that you were talking about learnings.
Yeah.
Right? And PMO is often, as you said, traditionally it's command and control. What have you done? And
Yeah.
it's not actually encouraging introspection of learning. So that's definitely something that I'll be taking back.
Great.
And when we're doing our health check, okay, well, how do you work? What is the team doing?
Great. I might turn the questions back round to yourself, actually. What's the biggest learning that you've got out of today? Sorry? Good old John Doe. Yeah. Is there anything that you're going to change in terms of what you measure?
No, but it's definitely a secret promotion.
Okay.
Being collaborative, it's definitely the same voice on the stimulation discussion.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else?
Is it more of a push, no, it's more of a pull, right? People come to you, then you go, or how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think, look, when we first started working with these guys, it was a bit more of a push. I think you can measure your success as a coach when it becomes a pull. So when people within the PMO itself pull for coaching and support from you. So yeah, you have to kind of tip somebody over the edge of change sometimes to start with. I mean, we were very lucky. We actually had the director of the area was really keen to start an agile transformation, so he almost gave that little bit of a push. I think unless you've got a small wedge in, it can be quite difficult. But I think, you know, I know that there's organisations, I've actually shared this with a large utilities organisation, and the person I've shared this with is actually looking at what some of the seeds, what some of the changes she wants to sow in there. So I'm not particularly coaching or consulting with her. I've given her some of this IP because I'm curious as to what that feedback is and how I can learn from that as well. So yeah, there's a bit of a balance between push and pull, I think. Anyone else? Nope. All good. You may have your lunch.